Değer yaratmanın formülü. Tasarım odaklı düşünme.
Hello, this is Mete Yurtsever, host of the Formula for Creating Value podcast. Today we are excited to have Phill Agnew with us. Phill is the host of the Nudge, the UK's top marketing podcast, where he breaks down consumer psychology and how it applies to marketing. He has a rich background in product marketing, having worked with companies like Buffer, Hotjar, Brandwatch. Phill excels at making complex psychological concepts easy to understand and apply. We are eager to hear his insights on using behavioral science to create value in both business and everyday life. Welcome, Phill.
Oh, thank you, Mette. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for a lovely introduction as well.
Thank you. So, as a fellow podcaster, I truly appreciate your efforts that you invest in each episode. Creating an engaging content is not an easy thing, and but you have this unique approach which I like most. I mean, like you have an editing after post-production. I mean, you just cut your questions and then have a small summary, and you set the context before your guests answer. And this demonstrates your deep understanding of the matter, and this meticulous editing enhances the clarity of each episode. And I think it also adds a lot on the seamless and efficient learning experience for the listener.
Yeah,
Just like a well-crafted documentary.
you could argue that it's totally idiotic because there are podcasters who do no editing,
Uh-huh.
just record, publish the recording, who will get, depending on the topic, far more views, listeners, and engagement than my show would get. Whereas for me, like you said, I record with the guest, I edit their recording, I write my own script, I do my
Uh-huh.
own research,
Uh-huh.
and then pitch together what is called in podcasting narrative discussion, but is essentially, like you say, a sort of mini documentary, 20-minute episodes from an
Uh-huh.
hour-long recording. So rather than sort of just spending half an hour on an episode, I'm spending close to 10, 20 hours.
Mm-hmm.
But I do it because I'm aware that there is a direct correlation between the effort you put into something and the value that people get out of that
Mm-hmm.
thing. So with a business podcast, a marketing podcast, I'm really conscious that business people are short on time, and being able to give them
Right.
something highly valuable within 20 minutes, I think is really beneficial. But yeah, you could still call me a bit of an idiot for spending that long time on
No,
something
come
which
on. No,
which could be shorter.
it's no, it's quite unique and quite a very nice experience. And each time you know what to expect from your podcast. I mean, like something like a good value. I mean, out of it. So that's quite a comfort for the listener, I would say.
No, thank you.
So our paths into behavioral science seems somewhat similar to me because I studied economics and in the early 90s, but
Hmm.
I didn't delve into behavioral science until the late 2000s, and I fully immersed myself in the late 2010s. So you studied marketing, and
Hmm.
how did you develop an interest in behavioral science?
Yes, maybe a quite different path because my marketing degree was sort of quite traditional in the sense that it focused on the parts of marketing strategy and tactics that are quite
Mhm.
high level. We did a lot on the 4Ps, on SWOT analysis, on blue ocean strategy. And after 4 years of this degree and a lot of money spent here in the UK,
Mhm.
I think we felt confident as students that we would be able to succeed in the marketing roles that we went and then got. But for me and for the majority of my peers, this didn't actually seem to be the case because what actually happens is you spend a lot of time studying strategy that you might need as a CEO of a Fortune 500 company,
Mhm.
and then you go and get a job where you're asked to do things like write a blog or
Mhm.
create an email subject line that people will click on,
Mhm.
or persuade people to come to a webinar,
Mhm.
or quite small level things, perhaps create a promotional page for an event in your area. So what we found as marketers was that we had studied extremely high level strategy, and we were actually being asked to do technical and
Mhm.
tactical persuasion techniques that
Mhm.
realistically we had very little idea of how to do it. So the first few years of my job, I really struggled. I didn't
Mhm.
really know how to create this content, these persuasional messages that would be convincing.
Mhm.
And I wasn't very good at my job. But eventually I stumbled across the world of behavioral science. So my
Mm-hmm.
entry into it was books like The Choice Factory by Richard
Mm-hmm.
Shotton,
Mm-hmm.
obviously influenced by Robert Cialdini,
Right.
Predictably Irrational by Dan Ariely,
Generally.
one of the first books I read. And it sort of revealed this world where I assumed marketing is based essentially on big data and gut instinct and maybe
Mm-hmm.
some high level strategy. And
Mm-hmm.
so to go from that was the world I understood, and I found it very difficult to apply those findings to say how to write a really good email subject line.
Mm-hmm.
And then behavioral science revealed a very different world, which suggested that marketing can be based on laws and principles that don't work every time, but
Mm-hmm.
much of the time are successful. And if you apply these laws and principles, you will boost the potential engagement of all of the different things you do, from creating a strategy to doing something more tactical. So I
Mm-hmm.
started applying all of these principles to my job, and I found they worked. And obviously, as sort of behavioral practitioners listening to this will agree with, it's when you actually try these things yourself and you see that they work that you start to become really convinced and persuaded. And that really was the start of my journey into behavioral science.
Great. Now, recently the news was out that Daniel Kahneman, the late Daniel Kahneman, he actually went on the some assisted death, right? It's he was in Switzerland, and he actually planned this, and after a couple of uh, days or weeks after his birthday, 90th birthday, he did this procedure in Switzerland, and this is he has this peak end rule, to end
Yeah.
something which is on the peak, and he previously, I mean, he traveled a couple of weeks before he traveled to Europe, and he spent a couple of weeks with his family. He visited with them where he spent his childhood and whatever. So everything was like perfect, and
Yeah.
and he planned for it. It's incredible. I mean, how much he internalized this
Of
approach of
course.
peak and rule.
And the famous Peak-End study, the 1993 study that Kahneman did and publicized in his book Thinking Fast and Slow, reveals why
Mm,
he took this action. So his study involved, I believe it was students or just perhaps normal participants who were asked to put both of their hands in cold water. So the
yeah.
water was, I think, 14 degrees. You had to keep it in there for 60 seconds. And
Hmm.
it's fairly icy cold and it's really quite uncomfortable. 14 degrees doesn't sound too cold, but it's actually quite
Yeah.
uncomfortable to keep your hands in there for 60 seconds. One group did that for 60 seconds, took their hands out, rated how much they enjoyed that experience. They didn't enjoy it, and rated how likely they would be to do it again. A second group, different population of people, put their hands in the same water for 60 seconds. It's still 14 degrees,
Hmm.
except Kahneman added an extra 30 seconds
Hmm.
to their experiment, where he increased the temperature from 14 degrees, which is uncomfortable, to 15 degrees, which is still very uncomfortable, but slightly less uncomfortable.
Hmm.
And what he found was those who had a longer time in the icy water, so that second group had 90 seconds in total, but the final 30 seconds was slightly more bearable.
Hmm.
Those who had more time in the icy water, because the end was slightly better from the majority,
Hmm.
enjoyed the experience more, were
Hmm.
more likely to say they'd do it again, were less likely to say it was a horrible experience. This incredible thing where, from a rational point of view, you would look at it and say, get your hands out of the water within 60
Exactly.
seconds, of course. Remove them. They
Yeah, yeah,
shouldn't be in there. You will enjoy it
yeah,
more if you just take your hands out after 60
yeah,
seconds rather than keeping them in for 90 seconds.
yeah,
And yet, that's not how the mind works. The
yeah.
final experience we have heavily influences our perception of it. And there are so many different ways you can apply this. But like you say, with Kahneman, he seems to have really taken it to heart
Yeah.
and decided that the final 2-3 weeks of his life need to be extremely beneficial, enjoyable, reflection,
Yeah.
lots of positive memories, because
Yeah.
that will boost his enjoyment of his life rather than, say, spending the final 3 weeks of his life on intensive care.
And definitely for the people around him also. I mean, like this is the like to see someone you love suffering is a hell. I mean, anyhow. So it's quite shocking experience, I would say. So
Mm.
I just mentioned this, and you just popped up this example, this experiment. You're quite into all these topics, of course. This is how you got inspired to start the Nudge podcast, because you wanted to share all these things that you learned. And I wonder how it's influenced your professional journey and personal growth.
Mm. I don't know why I decided to start the podcast. I guess I'm just a narcissist in the end, aren't I? I listened to a load of podcasts and thought, oh, I can probably do this. What an idiotic thing to think. But yeah, eventually started it. I emailed a few of my sort of heroes, Steve Martin, Richard Shotton,
Mhm.
a couple of others, Sybil Yang, who did a really interesting study,
Mhm.
and Adrian North, who did the famous study on wine sales in the
Mhm.
supermarket based on what
Mm.
music was playing. More
Yeah,
people
yeah.
buy French wine when French music is
German,
playing, more
yeah.
people buy German wine when German music is playing. And he was the first person I interviewed. And I just fell in love with the process
Mhm.
of speaking to people who are genuinely much smarter than me, who have done studies on the human mind, which reveal things to me and to the listeners that can quite sometimes shock, surprise, but also educate. And translating these incredible studies and findings into entertaining 20-minute episodes, that process, that creation, I
Mhm.
found deeply rewarding and satisfying. I started it in 2019. It's now 6 years on, almost
Mhm.
6 years in a month's time from when Nudge
Mhm.
Podcast started, and I still absolutely love it. I was just literally in the 5 minutes before coming on this episode, finishing up one of my own episodes where I've read a 102-year-old marketing book and tried to dissect whether any of the findings in this 100-century-old book are still
Wow.
relevant today. And it's just great fun. I really enjoy
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
process. So I sort of fell into it accidentally, have come to love it, and genuinely, completely enjoy the process of translating these very fascinating studies on human behavior into interesting and educational bits of content about marketing and business and
Mhm.
psychology.
Mhm. But I mean, so it comes so natural to you. I mean, you love it definitely. So before podcasting, were you like a storyteller among your friends and things like that? I mean, you were enjoying this?
I would like, yeah, I wouldn't say. No, that makes me sound like I'm sort of at the pub and everyone's leaning in and coming around and thinking, "Oh, what's Phill got to say?" I don't think I am, and I really enjoy the creative aspect of it.
Mhm.
But for me, it requires a lot of research, a lot of time,
Mhm.
and a lot of effort. I think I'd be a great storyteller at the pub
Mhm.
if you told me, Mette, that people are going to come and listen to your story today, and you've got 2 weeks to prepare a really great
Okay.
story. That I would love. That would be really fun for me if I can do my prep. The sort of on the spot storytelling that you might imagine that somebody who would really be into podcasting, I think most people who are into podcasting would be, is
Uh-huh.
it's probably something that I'm not particularly skilled at. But what I will say about storytelling is that it's extremely important. There's
Mhm.
no denying that a skill of a storyteller and studying storytelling will make you probably far better at your job. Will
Mhm.
Storr has written many fascinating books on the science of storytelling. Scott Galloway has talked at length about how he thinks storytelling
Mhm.
is the most important trait a young aspiring business person can have.
Cool.
And Will Storr, in his book, which I'm reading at the moment, a story is a deal, I think it's called. He,
Mhm.
he shares all the psychological studies that reveal that humans are deeply persuaded by stories. Stories
Definitely.
seem to be the thing that really capture us. He gives the wonderful example of Apple when they
Mhm.
released one of their first computers. They did
Mhm.
a newspaper ad which talked about the benefits, the features, the amount of memory, the
Mhm.
all of the standard things with no story. It just talked
Mhm.
about how this Mac computer had great processing power,
Mhm.
didn't garner any sales.
Mhm.
And then they released their Super Bowl ad, which is the 1984 Super Bowl ad,
Mhm. Mhm.
where it sort of pictures this Orwellian society where
Mhm.
people are lemmings to a giant Big Brother society, and then a female runs through, throws a hammer at the
Hammer.
Big
Mhm.
Brother screen, and the voiceover comes over and says, in January 1984, you'll learn why 1984 won't be like 1984. The idea being that Apple are going to release a
Yeah.
computer that will untie you from the restrictions of modern day
Uh-huh.
capitalism and allow you to be creative and wonderful and successful. And this story was far more, even though the story rationally has nothing to do with the product. You didn't have a
Mhm.
picture of the
Mhm.
computer. You couldn't see
Mhm.
anything, couldn't learn anything about the price. This story was far more persuasive than any rational
Mhm.
message about the Mac. So storytelling is vitally important. Understanding storytelling as a marketing is important. And as someone who's studying storytelling for the past
Mhm.
6 years, I can definitely agree and suggest to the listeners that it's something worthwhile analyzing.
And you often quote to also Steve Jobs, how he uses when he was doing this product presentations, how he was getting benefits of the behavioral psychology. I mean, about this the labor into it, whatever, how much he puts in it, and everything he does actually is a masterpiece, of course, on design thinking perspective also. That who needs a stylus? He says. I mean, like you use your hand, your finger. Or let's say instead of saying this much of the iPod takes this much of whatever space, whatever he says about 1,000 songs in your pocket or something like this. So everything is just, yeah. I mean, he's a very good example of the yeah.
He is a good example because it's perhaps lazy and it's traditional for a lot of people to look at Steve Jobs and say, well, he was a genius. He was one of a kind. It's no wonder that his keynote presentations were incredibly successful because he was magnificent. And that's quite lazy because that takes away from the reality, which is that Steve Jobs quite clearly deeply understood behavioral science, deeply understood human psychology, and altered his keynote speeches in many different, slightly small different ways to make his messages more persuasive. So the first example, which you brought up already, when you watch, and I've done this, there's a YouTube video. If you search for Nudge Podcast on YouTube, search Nudge Podcast Steve Jobs, you'll find 2 videos about all of his keynote speeches and how he used behavioral science. When you watch his keynote speeches back to back to back, which is what I did, you find that he starts putting in these small nudges to influence people. So there is an idea that if we showcase the effort that we have put in to our work, people will value that work more. Proven in multiple different studies that one of the most famous is a real estate agent who gives a list of houses to a potential buyer. Sometimes he or she says, this took me 10 minutes to prepare. Other times he or she says, this took me all night to prepare. In that second scenario, those who saw that list of houses, even though the list of houses were identical, those who saw the list of houses where they presumed effort went into it were far more likely to make an offer, far more likely to buy, far more likely to use the real estate service. So if we show the effort that we've put into something, we will value it far more highly. Steve Jobs starts almost every single one of his keynotes by saying, oh, I'm so excited to be here today because we have spent the past 3 years working night and day to create this product. In another, he says, if you came around the Apple offices on weekends, you will have seen the car park full because employees have been working night and day through weekends to bring this creation to you. He always explains the labor that has been put into his work, and that makes people value it highly. Another one that I love, he really understood anchoring. Now, anchoring is this idea that the initial piece of information we see subsequently influences how we perceive the rest of the information. So, fantastic example of this. I was at a pizza restaurant yesterday. Pizza is traditionally, you sort of look through the menu and the cheapest pizza is first, then you go down. What actually this pizza place did is they showed their highest price pizza at the top. So it was this pizza with lots of toppings, and it had a special dough, I think a turmeric dough. It didn't sound particularly nice. It was priced at like 20 quid. And so you see that, and then you look down the list, and suddenly the margarita priced at 11 quid. Seems like quite good value. Whereas if I looked at a menu where the margarita was 11 quid, I perhaps would think, oh, it's quite a high price for just a cheesy pizza. So we are anchored by the initial piece of information we see. So when Steve Jobs introduced the iPad, he was in a bit of a pickle because the majority of journalists were saying that people wouldn't need the iPad. They were saying, we have an iPod Touch, we have an iPhone, we have a Mac. Why on earth do we need an iPad? And when they were asked, these journalists, who again would be in the room when the keynote was taking place, when they were estimating how much this iPad would cost, many of them said, well, maybe it'll be $300. It shouldn't be that much. Maybe it'll be $500. A couple of them said $600. And 1 or 2 said it could cost $1,000. So Steve Jobs, when he's introducing the iPad, needs to frame it in a way that makes these journalists in the room perceive it to be good value. So obviously he talks about the labor illusion, talks about all the work put into it. But then when he gets onto the pricing part of the presentation, he presses a button and the figure $999 appears on screen behind him. He says, some of you in this room, this is all true, some of you in this room have predicted that the iPad will cost $1,000. I understand why you might predict that. This is groundbreaking technology. We've never released anything like this before. This is a new innovation to the market. It should cost more like $1,000. That was his anchor. And then he presses a button and the 999 smashes into thousands of pieces. And the true price of 499 reveals on screen. And the journalists in the room, who had been predicting that this thing would cost $500 anyway, are whooping and cheering, saying, "Oh, wow, I can't believe he's got it at 499." And he's only getting that reaction because he showcased the actual the perceived price of 999 beforehand.
Yeah.
He anchored them to a much higher price point, revealed the real price point. Suddenly, it seems like much better value. So Steve Jobs, he deeply understands behavioral science, psychology, and it's naive to just say, "Oh, he's a genius. He's one of a kind." It's far better to actually look at him and say, "Well, no, he was a genius. He was one of a kind, but he also worked hard to apply psychology into his persuasive appeals, and that made him more persuasive."
Brilliant, brilliant example. Thank you very much. So, before we move on to totally on behavioral science sphere, one last question about your podcast. I mean, about Nudge. I know it's quite challenging to single out specific episodes, but imagine that someone is tuning in for the first time. I mean, who listened to our podcast right now? Which one would you pick to start with and to listen to, or which ones? Would you have some recommendations?
Oh, it's always really hard. It's a very hard question to ask. I think have a look at the list and see what you like. Some of the most popular episodes are that Steve Jobs one, and another one, the Theranos case and Elizabeth Holmes. The work I've done with Rory Sutherland has been really popular as well.
Sure.
A very recent one, just to maybe give an example of one that has just come up, which you could maybe listen to, is I did an episode with with a memory professor to figure out how we can all improve our memory by using some sort of quite simple tips. That was really popular. One of the other things I like to do in my show is actually test some of the suggestions that people make. So I had Michael Norton on my show recently. That episode is titled "How a Harvard Professor Improved My Emails by 3.5 times" or something like that. Michael Norton is the guy who is behind the IKEA effect. So he wrote the initial studies on the IKEA effects back in 2011. He's written a new book called The Ritual Effect. But in his book, he reflects back on the IKEA effect and starts to talk about how, similar to what we were saying earlier, the more effort you put into your persuasive appeals, the more persuasive they'll be. So it's this idea of maybe mirror exposure effect, maybe labor illusion. But, if we make a really effortful plea, people will value that more. So don't ask your partner to marry you in a McDonald's after a $5 Happy Meal. Ask them to marry you after a $500 meal at a 5-star Michelin star restaurant. Your chances of a yes will be significantly higher in that second example to the first one. And so he says to me, a good way you could apply this is handwritten notes. So rather than sending an email to someone making an appeal, write them a handwritten note. It could be more effective. He didn't have any evidence to back that up. And so I said to him, well, maybe this is something I'll try. And I sent emails. I wanted to increase the number of reviews to my podcast. So I picked 40 Nudge listeners and I sent half of them just an email saying, could you leave Nudge a review? And then a link to leave a review. The other half, I sent a email again, but this email contained a picture of a handwritten note I had written to them specifically saying the exact same thing as the actual email. So it said the exact same words. So it said, can you leave a review of Nudge? Please click the link below. Then I included the link. So conventional wisdom would suggest these two messages are the same. After all, they contain the exact same content. But Norton suggested that the effort that I put into handwriting a note should make it more persuasive. Did it have any difference? It's small numbers. It's just 40 people. But in the first scenario where I just sent the email, only 2 people left me a review. In the second scenario where I did a quick handwritten note, 9 people left me a review.
Wow.
So a significant increase the amount of reviews I got. And again, this is only 20 people, so almost half of them actually went on to leave a review, which is quite good.
Yeah.
Significant change just based on this small psychological finding that Norton presented. So anyway, like to suggest that one because it's an example of not just how Nudge showcases how these tactics could work for you, but also how I test these tactics out myself and give examples of how you could perhaps apply them.
That's exactly what I was going to say as next question. I mean, we have a saying in Turkish. We say the tailor cannot sew his own hole. Like something like the shoemaker's son always goes barefoot, something like that. So, but you're not the case. It's not the case for you exactly. So you applied various behavioral science principles, such as understanding the negatives and the halo effect
Mhm.
you mentioned. Maybe to promote your podcast, I mean, you can share a couple of your discoveries. You already did one with the
Yeah.
handwriting. Do you recall, or would you like to share a few more?
Yeah, the reason I'm so keen on this is because I find it frustrating, especially within the marketing and business world, where you have these gurus who talk about quick wins, easy
Mm,
ways to get
mm,
success, and don't actually explain any study that they've set up to
mhm,
showcase how it works. So,
mhm,
this is survivorship bias, basically. We can
mhm,
all read Phil Knight's book on how he founded Nike and try and take findings from it, but let's be honest here, it's not a randomized controlled trial. It's
mhm,
not, we haven't got multiple Nikes to compare if the things that he did as a leader actually made a difference. Same with reading Elon Musk's autobiography by Walter Isaacson or even Steve Jobs. You know,
mhm,
you could argue that I was maybe suffering from the survivorship bias when I gave his example. It's much
mhm,
better to actually test these things out ourselves to see if they work. So,
mhm,
as an example, I read about a very interesting study on the halo effect. Now, the halo effect is this idea that if there is if we have positive associations with someone, something, some brand, they will spill over
mhm,
to the things that they are associated with. So we
mhm,
perceive George Clooney to be a very talented actor.
mhm,
That perceived greatness spills over onto other things like his views on coffee. So when he
mhm,
advertises Nespresso, we're more likely to buy it, not because George Clooney has any knowledge of how great coffee could be or how
mhm,
good Nespresso is,
mhm,
but simply because we perceive him to be a great actor, that spills over and we assume he must be great at picking coffee as well. That's the halo effect. And there was a very interesting study that suggested that stores, so retail stores, placed next to a high end luxury store that is perceived to be great,
mhm,
Gucci, Rolex, these types
mhm,
of stores,
mhm,
stores placed next to them will see higher sales, so more people coming through the door, and a higher sale value per person simply because of their proximity to the store.
mhm,
This blew my mind a little bit because I was like, I understand how George Clooney advertising Nespresso can boost appeal for Nespresso, but putting, I don't know, H&M next to a
mhm,
Gucci store, will that really influence people?
mhm,
And so I decided to test it. I did it with my podcast. So I created a Google survey test. This is when Google survey still runs. There are lots of
mhm,
other new
mhm,
platforms that run it. But in this Google survey test, I sent a question to 1,000 people asking, would you listen to this podcast?
mhm,
And then I included a picture of my podcast below. But I doctored the picture. So
mhm,
500 just saw a picture of my
mhm,
podcast.
mhm,
The other 500 saw a picture of my podcast in the forefront, but
mhm,
then in the background of that picture, slightly darkened, so they knew
mhm,
they weren't being asked about that, were the images of other UK, because this was a UK survey,
mhm, mhm,
popular UK podcasts. So
mhm,
for the UK, this is Desert Island Discs, Off Menu, Diary of a CEO, a couple of
mhm,
others.
mhm,
So both groups are asked the same question: would you listen to this podcast? But one of them, I'm applying this halo effect study.
mhm,
Being next to Gucci might boost
mhm,
H&M's appeal. Being
mhm,
next to Desert Island's disc might boost Nudge appeal. Did it have a difference?
mhm,
Well, when those who were asked, would you listen to this podcast, saw just the logo of my podcast,
mhm,
6.2% said they would
mhm,
listen.
mhm,
When they saw the logo of my podcast over the top, overlaid on top of other popular podcasts, 15.6% said
Amazing.
they would listen. So huge increase.
2.5 times, yeah.
Actual proof that this does seem to work. So, I mean, ways that I apply this is well, I'm lucky enough to sometimes get very popular authors on the show: Dan Pink, Rory Sutherland,
Mhm,
Charles Duhigg, Tally
mhm,
Sherratt, Chris
mhm,
Voss. These people have very positive associations.
mhm,
I take the photos of me and them talking, and I publish them on my website, and I put them in my email outreach to new authors.
mhm,
I apply that halo effect that way, and there's other ways brands can apply this as well. A wonderful study that I love showed that when you have a positive brand in your ingredients list, for
mhm,
example, if you use Nutella, positive brand,
mhm,
in your chocolate cake,
mhm,
saying this is a chocolate cake with Nutella in it is
mhm,
far actually boosts the appeal, the likelihood of a sale, and the enjoyment based on naming that same chocolate cake just chocolate cake with hazelnut spread in it. And so you can really apply this in all sorts of wonderful ways. That's how I applied it with the halo effect. There's lots of other examples as well. A quick one is we applied this idea I talked about at the start, which is this Steve Jobs idea that the effort you showcase will increase the perceived value. So I did 2 Reddit ads to promote my end of year show. One said, learn the 6 best marketing lessons I've heard this year, and then a picture of my podcast. The other ad said, I've spent 482 minutes listening to marketing experts this year. Here are the 6 lessons I've learned. So conventionally, very similar message. The listeners are going to receive the same content. They're going to learn 6 lessons. However, in one, I've stated all the work that I've put in. I've said I've spent 482 minutes listening to these experts. Turns out when I talked about the experts that I've listened to, that was 15%, or it had a 15% higher click-through rate than the control. So again, applying these principles seems to work. So there's wonderful ways you can apply this. It's always useful to test, and it's important as well because, as you'll know, Mette, when you are applying behavioral science, these things work differently depending on the audience, depending on the product, depending on the service. And it's vital that we test these things out ourselves because they won't always work directly in the way that the studies suggest they might.
Exactly. So I'd like to ask 2 questions in one, actually. One, we know this ethical issues around nudging and sludging, more manipulative way in marketing practices. And the second question, which ties to that one, is actually, do you think people can be taught to avoid these biases, which are in the sludge way? Well, they might also avoid the nudges as well. But and I'm curious also, like, since you got immersed into this field, do you find yourself more immune to nudges, or are you just as susceptible as anyone else?
Definitely not more immune. I'll get to that in the end. Firstly, let's cover this idea that is this ethical. I think the first thing to say, and this is what Thaler and Sunstein and Phil Barden in his book Decoded, what they say is, and this is very true, you are always being nudged. Whether somebody is implementing a nudge or not, you'll be nudged one way or the other. Take that menu example I gave you earlier.
Right.
You have to put something at the top of the menu. You could put a high-priced item. You could put a low-priced item. You could do it randomly. It doesn't matter. You will be anchored by that initial piece of information. Well before behavioral science was ever studied in the history of human society, nudging always took place. I mean, a great example, we've been talking about how effort equals perceived value. Just look at the religious leaders of the past. In Buddhism, you had to hand carve your prayers onto stone so they could be heard by God. There's no so they could be heard by the Buddha. There's good reason for this, right? They understood, even if they didn't have studies to prove it, that effort you put into something will increase the value you feel from it. They knew that aspiring monks would feel more value if they hand carved a prayer into stone than if they simply just said a prayer out loud. So people have been nudged for centuries before we even knew about it, and you'll be nudged one way or the other anyway. You know, the menu is there. You need to see information. You can't perceive information in a way that won't be subject to your own biases and perceptions. Now, the more perhaps interesting question is then, well, if somebody is actively trying to influence you and knows that they are applying some nudges, can that be ethical? And what you should then ask yourself is, if somebody was applying this principle to me, would I be okay with it? So, for example, if somebody, let's use my example of tweaking my Reddit ad to encourage people to click. Well, if somebody was doing that, would I be okay with it? Of course I am. I realize that every single advert in the world is optimized to get me to do something. Of course, I am okay with the fact, well, okay is maybe a different word, but of course I accept the fact that adverts and marketing in general will try and be persuasive. That it would be ridiculous to suggest that is not okay because of nudging. I mean, that's marketing and that's been around for centuries. And then you ask yourself, well, if somebody went ahead with this action, would they then receive something or change their lifestyle in a way that would be detrimental to them. And I think a great way of thinking about this is, would you be annoyed or frustrated or saddened if your younger sister or your mother or your grandfather ended up taking the action that the nudger is trying to persuade you to do? That's an important one, because would I be frustrated if my grandfather ended up listening to a podcast episode? Not at all, of course. Totally fine. But when you start using these principles to encourage people to gamble away their life savings, to persuade people to take up drinking, to encourage people to start vaping, to persuade people to perhaps, I don't know, do something that they perhaps you wouldn't want them to do, that's where I think it becomes problematic. So there is problems with using nudges, but those problems only seem to come from using them to encourage people to do behavior that we wouldn't want them to do. And I think, honestly, this is not a conversation about behavioral science or nudging. It's a conversation about marketing, advertising standards, and whether companies that create harmful products, harmful services, should be able to market their services. There's a great book called The Empire of Pain by Patrick Radden Keefe, where he studied the history of advertising for opioids. And it's fascinating because it showed how slow legislation takes to catch up with some of the products that are really harmful. Opioids was really harmful in America, caused an opioid crisis, killed many, many people. And it took so long for the government to actually get to the point where they were stopping and reducing the amount of advertising that these companies could create. Same was true for tobacco, same is true for alcohol, same is true for gambling, same is true for fast food. And this is a much broader problem about legislation, marketing, and advertising in general than just behavioral science.
Exactly. So, and last question before the signature question is about that. So if we think about human behavior, so it's not major changes happening in there. I mean, like, we are the same human as we were a couple of hundred thousands of years, let's say. But where this is leading to, what are the, I mean, with the AI right now, I don't know, maybe we will also hand over some of our agency to AI. So what future will bring on in terms of
It's a great question. I think I mentioned at the start, I've just been reading this book, Scientific Advertising by, it's blurred out there, but it's Scientific Advertising by Claude Hopkins. It's 102 years old. And it's really a jumble of different articles, but the main theme that Claude talks about in the book is that data will change marketing, and it will no longer make marketing a gamble. He says, if you do A/B tests, if you do split testing, you will get to a point where marketing is no longer a gamble. And he predicts a future in 10 years' time, this is back in the 1920s, where marketers will always be successful. It would all be foolproof. You put £10 into an ad, you've tested the ad and you know it works, and thus you will get £20, and it will be a never-ending flywheel, and companies will never go bankrupt, and marketing will always be successful. This is what he predicted 100 years ago. There's a lot of good stuff in that book, but that was bogus. That was absolute rubbish, because that has not been proven to be true. Data has not made us gamble-free, certain marketers. Even with all the data in the world, companies fail. Liquid Death failed in the UK. 60% of new businesses in the UK fail within 3 years. 95% of new product launches fail, according to Harvard Business Review. This wouldn't be the case if marketing was foolproof. So clearly, an endless amount of data will not save us from marketing. And for the same reason, I don't believe that access to AI will save us. And the reason I believe that is because the world is far too chaotic and consumers are far too irrational for that to ever be the case. I believe that what behavioral science does is it gives you a slight edge over those who perhaps don't understand behavioral science principles. It allows you as a marketer or a business or a business professional to perhaps better understand how your consumers make decisions and adapt in this chaotic world to some of the changes in behavior that you see and take advantage of them. It will never make your job foolproof. It will never save your company from ever potentially going bankrupt. And it will never ensure that all of your product launches are a success. It simply can't do that in the same way that data hasn't done that for Claude Hopkins. And I don't think AI will do that in the future. The world is too chaotic. People are too irrational. A great example of AI is that we believe that AI generated content might become so persuasive because it understands all of these persuasive
Yeah.
principles that it will be able to convince us to do anything. And
Mm.
yet, at the exact same time, studies show that people who find out that content is written by AI will
Mm.
simply ignore it. They do not
Mhm.
take it seriously and they don't value it. So, those two things can be true. This is how chaotic our world is. That
Yeah.
AI could be extremely persuasive, but as soon as somebody knows it's AI, they won't value it at all. And then you get to a point where if you read an extremely persuasive message that should persuade you, you might perceive it to be AI, even if it is not, and then it will not
Yeah.
persuade you in the way that it should. And so suddenly an unpersuasive message might be more persuasive. This is the way the world will be far too chaotic for behavioral science to ever take over. And yet, that said, marketers fundamentally are in the decision making industry. Our goal is to change and influence the decisions of people we are trying to market towards.
Mm.
As marketers, therefore, we have to understand how
Mm.
people make decisions. We
Mm.
have to study the
Mm.
processes people make to make decisions.
Mhm.
If we don't, it's like going in blind. It would be
Exactly.
like being a fireman without actually understanding the mechanics of fire and how
Mhm.
to put out fire. It'd be like being a chef without deeply understanding how different flavors
Mm.
combine together. We need to understand how people make decisions. The way to understand how people make decisions is to study behavioral science. And that won't make you a foolproof marketer, but it will give you a level up compared
Mhm.
to your peers.
Mhm. Great. Well, then comes to the signature question. So, based on your experiences and expertise, what is your personal formula for creating value? It can be both professional and personal.
Yeah, my personal formula, and I read a lot of books on behavioral science,
Mm.
and most of my views and my evidence and my insights are taken from other people. But something that I truly believe, and perhaps I think is not talked about enough, we've covered it a little bit in this podcast,
Mhm.
is that effort amplifies everything. So
Mhm.
if you look at, for example, Cialdini's principles of influence,
Mhm.
scarcity, liking,
Mhm.
reciprocity, these sorts of things,
Mhm.
these all work. And you can get into this mindset that, well, reciprocity, for example, to the listeners, is the idea that if I do you a favor, Mehdi, you
Mhm.
will be more likely to return that favor in the future.
Mhm.
So if I
Mhm.
send you a mug after this of the Nudge Podcast logo, and then in 2 months' time say, oh, do you mind sharing the show? You'll be more likely to do that because you will want to reciprocate that gift. That is true. But somebody can look at that and think, well, okay, all this is a silver bullet. I just need to programmatically apply this and it'll be beneficial. So I will just send everybody in my email list, all 100,000 people, a 50 cents voucher, and
Mhm.
they will be more likely to return that gift. And I can apply this in a way. But what that misses is that effort directly impacts the quality of that appeal. So the more effort you put in, the more you will get out. The less effort you put in, the less you will get out.
Mhm.
We live in a world of marketing at the moment of this
Mhm.
idea of quick wins. Use AI to write an email in seconds. Use AI to create a YouTube video in minutes.
Mhm.
Apply this one small hack and you
Mhm.
will boost your appeal. And I advocate for the opposite. The more effort you put in, the more you can showcase that effort, the more your content appears to be effortful, the more people will value it more
Mhm.
highly. So I
Mhm.
believe, using the reciprocity
Mhm.
as an example, if you want to apply reciprocity in the most effective way possible, you shouldn't think, how can I do this at scale and programmatically apply this? You
Mhm.
should think, how can I create the most effortful
Mhm.
version of this? And what will that look like? Because that will be so successful that it will have a really
Mhm.
huge impact.
Mhm. Mhm.
So there, all sorts of ways you can apply this. Claude
Mhm.
Hopkins in this book that I've been talking about throughout the show talks about, and again, this is why we have known this for so long before there was even studies. He
Mhm.
does give a wonderful example of an advertiser who was trying to sell leather-bound books, notebooks, didn't have any
Mhm.
success. And
Mhm.
then all the advertiser did was put the name of the person that they were trying to sell it to on the leather-bound book, and then suddenly it was far more successful. You and I are far more likely to buy a notebook with our name on it than we
Yeah.
would be if we were to apply a blank one. So a bit of reciprocity, we feel they've done us a favor, gone
Yeah.
out their way to apply our name, said it's
Yeah.
free, we're more likely to respond. Now that's
Yeah.
far more effective than perhaps if you just gave a 10% discount. Both
Mhm.
of those are favors, and we might feel
Mhm.
the need to
Mhm.
reciprocate those favors, but the more effort you put in, the more you'll value it. So
Mhm.
this is my this is where I come at it, and it links right back to what we spoke about at the start of the show.
Mhm.
Why do I spend 10 hours creating a podcast episode when I could create one, when I arguably have the same amount of listeners as if I would have as if I just spent 1 hour creating the show? Well, it's because I deeply believe that people value effort, and the more effort I put into the content I create, the more people will value it. And there's lots of examples of how this apply, but if I want to create value, I'll increase the effort that I'm putting in.
Great. So this reciprocity thing is something that all Turkish listeners would resonate with quite easily. I don't know if you have been to Istanbul. I mean, if you
Yep.
want to covered bazaar, I mean, like the way the shop owner treats you. I mean, he offers you some sweets or some teas, whatever. All these things like to accommodate you and to make you feel good. But of course, you feel to do something back. I mean, like with all this service and everything. Yeah. Great. So before we wrap up, I mean, I want to highlight that you offer a newsletter that people can subscribe to, and then a marketing course that our listeners can benefit from. And of course, they can always tune into Nudge Podcast for more insights. Is there anything else you'd like to add or share with our audience?
I've mentioned a lot of books today, and often when I talk about books, people want a document which covers them just to see if there's any they haven't read. I've just released a reading list for 2025, which contains 25 books I'd recommend and 5
great.
I suggest marketers avoid. Perhaps we can leave the link to that reading list in the show notes of today's
Definitely in the
episode.
show notes, yeah.
If you sign up to that, you get the reading list for free. And you can see all these books that you might potentially want to read, and that could be quite helpful.
Awesome. Thank you, Phill, for sharing your valuable thoughts and insights with us today. And it's been a great pleasure to host you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Messi. Cheers.
Bu podcast'te değer yaratmanın çerçevesini oluşturan davranış bilimi, kişisel gelişim, girişimcilik, pazarlama ve inovasyon alanlarından yurt içinden ve yurt dışından bilim insanlarına, akademisyenlere, tasarımcılara, iş insanlarına, danışmanlara ve eğitmenlere değer yaratma formüllerini soruyorum. Amacım Türkiye'de değer yaratmaya çalışan kişilere konuklarımın deneyimlerinden ilham vermek. Hatta ilham vermenin ötesinde elimden geldiğince bu yolda kolaylaştırıcı olmak istiyorum. Bu amaçla kurduğum kitap ve sinema kulübüne, verimlilik ve üretkenlik alanındaki uygulamalar hakkında bilgi alışverişinde bulunduğumuz dijital akıl kulübüne katılabilirsiniz. Eğer kariyerinizde bir değişiklik ya da mevcut işinizde kendinizi geliştirmek istiyorsanız, farklı disiplinlerden kafa dengi, öğrenmeye açık insanların birbirlerinin gelişimine, üretimine destek, ortak olma taahhüdüyle bir araya geldiği derya topluluğumuza katılabilirsiniz. Tüm bu topluluklar hakkında daha fazla bilgi almak ve kayıt olmak için açıklamalarda linkini bulacağınız Patreon sayfamı veya meteyurtsever.com'u ziyaret edebilirsiniz. İş yerinizde tasarım odaklı düşünme yaklaşımıyla problemlerinizi yeni bir bakış açısıyla çözmenizde size nasıl yardımcı olabileceğimi öğrenmek için ise info@meteyurtsever.com'a mesaj gönderebilirsiniz. Bu podcast'i beğendiyseniz lütfen arkadaşlarınızla paylaşmaktan, takip almaktan ve değerlendirme bırakmaktan üşenmeyin. Eleştiri, beğeni ve önerilerinizi bekliyorum ve şimdiden teşekkür ediyorum. Tekrar görüşünceye dek sağlıkla kalın, hoşça kalın.